Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really foundational text, Walter Brueggemann's The Theology of the Book of Jeremiah. If you're looking to, get a handle on this pivotal prophetic book and really pull out the key insights, well, you've come to the right place.
That's absolutely right. Bruggeman's work, it gives us this remarkable lens, really, to understand the core theological arguments in Jeremiah and the critical historical context that shaped them.
Yeah, definitely. And for anyone who maybe isn't familiar, Walter Brueggemann is, well, he's a major voice in Old Testament scholarship.
Oh, for sure.
He's the William Marcellus McPheeters Professor Emeritus of Old Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary. Widely respected for his work, especially, on Psalms and the prophetic books.
Yeah, classics like his Introduction to the Old Testament or Theology of the Old Testament. These are really significant contributions.
Exactly. And he's still active, co-authoring commentaries. So we know we're dealing with a really deep, knowledgeable perspective here on Jeremiah.
Absolutely. So in this deep dive, we're going to focus on Bruggemann's central arguments about Jeremiah. We'll try to nail down the major theological themes he highlights and also the crucial historical events that influence the book.
Right. So our mission today basically is to navigate the complexities of Jeremiah, to really get to grips with its core theological claims, especially that big one about Yhwh's sovereignty and, see why this ancient text still matters so much.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay, let's dive in. First off, why does Bruggeman see Jeremiah as so complex? What are the main reasons?
Well, what's really fascinating, and Bruggeman points this out, is that the book of Jeremiah isn't just like one person speaking with one voice. It's more like this rich tapestry woven from multiple perspectives. And each one is trying to make sense of this really profound historical and theological crisis. They offer different takes on the same huge events.
So it's like a conversation happening across time almost.
Precisely. And that leads straight into the second reason for its complexity. The book developed over a really long time, probably spanning several generations after Jeremiah himself.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, we even get a hint of this in the book itself, Jeremiah 36.32. It mentions that many similar words were added to the original scroll,
Right.
which suggests, a living tradition. Later writers, editors, they kept reflecting on Jeremiah's messages, expanding them.
So we're not just hearing Jeremiah's exact words, but also how later people understood them, grappling with the same events from their own time.
Exactly. These different voices, they came from really different situations. Some were writing before Jerusalem was destroyed in 587 BCE.
Okay.
Others were writing right after that devastation, and still others were sort of on the cusp of returning from exile. They weren't just separated by time, but by how they understood what happened and why.
So Bruggeman talks about how scholars have tried to untangle this. He mentions source analysis. Can you unpack that a bit?
Sure. The older approach, people like Mowinkle and Dumm, they suggested the book was basically compiled from different literary sources.
Right, like different documents pieced together.
Kind of. They proposed an A source, Jeremiah's original poems, maybe? A B source prose, maybe from his scribe Baruch? And a C source later stuff, similar to the book of Deuteronomy.
The Deuteronic influence.
Yeah. Now, today, scholars are maybe less rigid about these exact sources, but that early work was important. It really highlighted how diverse the book is internally.
And what about more current approaches? How do scholars look at it now?
Well, you have someone like William Holiday, whose commentary is massive. He tends to see more unity. He thinks even with different layers, there's an editor shaping it to preserve the prophet's legacy.
Okay.
Then you have Robert Carroll, who's a bit more critical. He wonders if some of the later prose editions might actually, obscure or even distort Jeremiah's original voice.
Interesting tension there.
Yeah.
But Bruggeman seems to lean more towards Louis Stolman's view.
Yes, he does. Stolman argues that these big prose sections aren't distortions, but more like intentional interpretive guides.
Signposts.
Exactly. Signposts put there to help readers understand the poetry around them. He sees the whole book as this ongoing dynamic discussion within the community about the catastrophe of 587 BCE, the fall of Jerusalem.
Okay.
So yeah, scholars dissect it differently, but Bruggeman's point is key. See it as this conversation grappling with a huge crisis, not just random bits.
A community really wrestling with something devastating. Okay, so this huge crisis, the Davidic dynasty collapsing, Solomon's temple destroyed this, had a massive theological impact. Why was it such a challenge to how they understood God?
Well, think about it. These institutions, the monarchy, the temple, they were seen as long-standing, divinely guaranteed. Their fall just shook the foundations of Judah's whole understanding of their relationship with
It
it.
wasn't just politics or war.
No, exactly. It seemed to fly in the face of everything they believed about God's favor, God's protection for Jerusalem, for the Davidic king. The crisis was so deep, their old ways of explaining things just didn't work anymore.
So how did they start to reinterpret these awful events?
This is where the idea of Yhwh's sovereignty becomes absolutely central, but not just over Judah, over all nations.
Okay.
So the destruction wasn't just random bad luck. It was seen as happening within Yhwh's larger plan, even using powerful empires like Babylon as instruments.
Right.
The theologian Klaus Kolch called this meta-history. It's like seeing God's hand in the big sweeps of history, not just individual lives. Bruggeman even mentions Paul Kennedy's secular work on great powers, suggesting a kind of underlying logic to history that can be read theologically.
That's fascinating. Did everyone come up with the same theological response, though?
Oh, definitely not. Different views emerged. It really depended on where people were, what they went through.
Right.
Those who stayed behind in Judah, they had one perspective. Those deported to Babylon, a completely different experience, a different interpretation.
And the book reflects both.
It does, yeah. It mentions Gedaliah, the governor the Babylonians appointed, for example. But as Norman Godwald points out, the perspective from exile, seeing it as punishment, hoping for return, that view kind of ended up dominating the tradition.
I see.
The voices of those who stayed, their struggles. We get glimpses, like in the Book of Lamentations, but they were largely overshadowed.
So, amidst all this complexity, this crisis, Bruggeman argues Jeremiah's theology is built on Yhwh's comprehensive sovereignty. Let's dig into that. What does that really mean?
Well, the foundation here is that Yhwh's rule isn't passive. It's not just an idea. It's active in history, especially in forming this covenant relationship with the people, starting way back with the Exodus from Egypt.
I am the Lord your God who brought you out.
Exactly. Exodus 20.2, that's Yhwh's big public statement. I acted for you. I am committed.
And that act of liberation then leads to the covenant at Sinai.
Right. And the Ten Commandments, they aren't just like good advice. They're the core policy statement for this new community. The expectations. Henning-Graf Reventlow even reads that first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. Not just as a prohibition, but as a statement of fact. For Israel, there just are no other gods who've done what you did.
And this covenant is presented as very serious, all-encompassing, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. It's a binding agreement. Total loyalty and obedience are expected. And we see hints of consequences early on, blessings for sticking with it, curses for straying, even back in Exodus 23.
Which gets spelled out later in Leviticus and Deuteronomy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Much more fully developed there.
But the covenant isn't totally rigid, is it? I mean, the golden calf incident happens right after Sinai.
That's such a crucial moment. It shows both the human capacity to mess up badly and also divine grace.
Right.
Exodus 32:34 tells that story. Israel's big betrayal, worshiping the calf. Moses breaks the tablets, symbolizing the broken deal. But then, amazingly, Yhwh doesn't just walk away. Moses argues, pleads, and the covenant gets renewed. It shows Yhwh's commitment endures, even when Israel fails.
So how does later prophecy, like Jeremiah's, build on this covenant idea?
Well, the prophet Hosea gives us this incredibly powerful imagery. He uses marriage, divorce, reconciliation.
That metaphor.
Yeah, to depict the Yhwh-Israel relationship. It's not just a legal contract anymore. It's deeply emotional. Intense love, painful betrayal, but also maybe a way back. Hosea 2 is just stunning in showing this. David Kleins has analyzed its artistry. It's really something. That relational piece adds another whole layer to Yhwh's sovereignty.
So it's not just raw power, but passionate involvement. And then Deuteronomy comes along and adds another layer, focusing on the land.
Yes, Deuteronomy really connects the Yhwh-Israel land relationship directly to obeying the Torah, the law.
Okay.
The land isn't just a gift anymore. Keeping it becomes conditional on faithfulness. If you disobey, you risk losing the land.
And that becomes devastatingly real for Jeremiah.
Exactly. He witnesses that very loss. It's central to his whole context.
Okay, so against this backdrop covenant, sovereignty, the threat of land loss, we have Jeremiah himself. Now, there's debate about the historical figure, but what does Bruggeman stress about his role here?
Bruggeman acknowledges the scholarly debates, sure, but he mainly emphasizes Jeremiah's place within that Deuteronomic framework we just talked about.
So he wasn't totally out of the blue.
No, his message wasn't completely new. It resonated deeply with this existing understanding. Covenant, consequences for disobedience, judgment.
What about his background? Does that tell us anything?
Well, the book opens saying he's the son of Hilkiah. Now, it's tempting, maybe speculative, to connect him to the high priest Hilkiah from 2 Kings 22.
The one who found the Deuteronomy scroll.
Right. We can't know for sure, but the potential connection is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
And we know he wasn't totally alone. He had associates like Baruch, his scribe, who was vital in writing things down.
Right. Jeremiah 36.
And Seraiah, who carried that symbolic judgment against Babylon. So he had a support network of sorts.
But his calling was clearly incredibly tough. We hear about his confessions. What's that about?
Oh, absolutely. His job was just emotionally brutal. The confessions, mostly in chapters 11-20, are these raw, personal outcries. He's wrestling with this huge tension. God called him, promised support, but his message doom for Jerusalem just brought him opposition, isolation, terrible anguish.
Yeah, you can feel it in the text.
Definitely. Scholars like Westerman, O'Connor, others, they've really dug into these passages. They show the human cost of being that kind of prophet.
So Jeremiah's message has this kind of twofold nature, doesn't it? Heavy on judgment, but also hints of future restoration. How do these link back to the covenant tradition?
Well, like we said, the idea of covenant sanctions, blessings, and curses, it's there from the start, in Exodus.
Right.
Then prophets like Hosea and especially Deuteronomy really develop it. That sets the stage perfectly for Jeremiah's message.
And how does Jeremiah himself embody this judgment and hope thing?
That verse in his call, Jeremiah 1.10, is key. You says, "See, today I appoint you to pluck up and to pull down, to destroy and to overthrow." That's the judgment part.
Negative verbs.
Right. 4 of them. But then it finishes, to build and to plant. That's the hope, the restoration. Those 6 verbs capture his whole mission.
And it wasn't just about predicting things, was it? His words seemed to carry weight to do something.
Exactly. Prophetic speech in this worldview wasn't just description. It was often seen as performative. Meaning the act of declaring it in Yhwh's name could actually help bring it about, enact it, which you can imagine made Jeremiah's words of doom incredibly threatening to the establishment.
No wonder they didn't like him.
Not at all. And you see the severity when Yhwh actually tells Jeremiah not to pray for the city sometimes. Like, it's too late, the judgment is set.
Wow, that's stark. Yet even then, Jeremiah complains to God, right? Those laments.
Yes, absolutely. Passages in Jeremiah 12, 15, 17. He cries out, questions God, feels frustrated, even accuses God of being unreliable.
And how does God respond?
Interestingly, not always with comforting words. Often it's more like, toughen up, you have a job to do. A reaffirmation of the hard task. Abraham Heschel's idea of divine pathos is helpful here. Maybe Jeremiah's agony mirrors Yhwh's own grief over what has to happen. He's tapping into God's sorrow.
But Jeremiah wasn't the only prophet around. He clashed with others, didn't he?
Oh, big time. He was in direct conflict with prophets who were cozy with the king and the temple priests.
The establishment prophets.
Exactly. They were preaching peace, security, saying Jerusalem was safe, totally contradicting Jeremiah's message of disaster. Jeremiah 6 and 23 really lay out this clash.
What was the core of their disagreement? Why were they so opposed?
Fundamentally, it was about discerning true versus false prophecy. Were they speaking for views or just saying what people wanted to hear?
Right.
The establishment guys, maybe they genuinely believed Jerusalem was inviolable, or maybe they just didn't want to rock the boat. Either way, they refused to deliver the bad news about judgment and the Babylonian threat.
But the story didn't just end with destruction. The tradition around Jeremiah kept going, adapted.
That's a really crucial point. Yes, the Jeremian tradition lived on and evolved, especially with the community exiled to Babylon.
So it shifted focus to them.
It did. They started to see themselves as the true remnant, the heirs of the covenant, even in exile. You see this shift in Jeremiah 24 and then in chapters 40-42.
Okay.
They acknowledged Yhwh's judgment was just, but they also began looking ahead, anticipating judgment on Babylon eventually, and hoping for Judah's restoration. The scribes were key in carrying this forward.
So through all this turmoil, Yhwh is always the main actor. Bruggeman really hammers home Yhwh's unrivaled sovereignty, even in judgment.
Precisely. Yhwh is always portrayed as being in the right, even when delivering devastating judgment. Bruggeman walks through several powerful metaphors for this.
Like what?
Well, picking up on Hosea, Jeremiah 2:4 depicts Yhwh as a scorned spouse. It's all about Israel's infidelity, Yhwh's betrayed love. The text even puts words in Israel's mouth, showing their defiance.
And then the imagery shifts. Becomes more forceful.
Yes, in Jeremiah 4:6, Yhwh becomes the provoked and punishing sovereign, actively using military invasion, and Babylon is clearly the weapon of choice against stubborn Judah.
But even then, there's still a sense of sorrow underneath the anger.
Absolutely. In Jeremiah 8:9, the image shifts again. Yhwh is the powerful healer who tragically can't heal Jerusalem. It's too far gone.
A contrast with earlier promises of healing.
Right, like in Exodus. It shows how deep the sickness is. Yhwh grieves over my poor people. The judgment feels agonizingly necessary.
But how does you as creator fit in?
Bruggeman points to Jeremiah 5. Yhwh is the creator of order. Israel ignores this divine order, rejects wisdom, justice, and basically brings destruction on themselves.
So it's not always direct punishment. Sometimes it's just consequences.
Kind of, yeah. Like they're reaping what they sowed by ignoring how the world is meant to work, which leads to Yhwh as both God of life and God of death in Jeremiah 10. Life comes from Yhwh, but disobedience opens the door for death. And finally, Yhwh is also shown as angry and unrestrained sometimes, targeting the leaders, prophets, priests, kings for their failures.
So the poetry uses these rich, sometimes shifting images.
Yeah.
But the prose sections, they're more direct.
That's a key difference Bruggeman highlights. The prose, especially in big sections like the Temple Sermon in chapter 7 or the Potter Story in chapter 18, it lays out a much clearer either
obey or face the consequences.
Pretty much. Staying in the land is tied directly to repentance, justice, ditching idols. Jeremiah 7:5-7 spells it out. But ultimately, Israel's stubbornness seals their fate, as Jeremiah 18:12 shows. They won't change.
And the prose uses those memorable actions too, right? The loincloth, the broken flask.
Yes, those enacted parables. The ruined loincloth in chapter 13, Judah, was supposed to be close to God. Now it's useless. The smashed flask in chapter 19, Jerusalem's destruction will be just like that, sudden and irreparable. And crucially, the prose, like in chapter 20, explicitly names Babylon as Yhwh's agent of wrath.
No ambiguity there.
None. And it continues with the blunt message to King Zedekiah in chapter 21. Yhwh himself will fight against Jerusalem using Babylon. The consistent advice: submit to Babylon. That's Yhwh's will now.
And historically, that judgment did happen. Jerusalem fell, the exile began.
Absolutely. A devastating historical reality that fulfilled Jeremiah's words. 2 Kings 25 and Jeremiah 39 record it vividly.
But the focus doesn't stay just on Judah's judgment, does it? Bruggeman points out it broadens later.
Yes, in Jeremiah 25, and then really expanded in chapters 46-51, the lens pulls back. Now it's about judgment on all the surrounding nations.
Including Babylon itself.
Especially Babylon. It becomes a major target. There's this Hebrew verb, Yhwh, to stir up, used in chapters 50-51. Yhwh is stirring up powers against Babylon.
Which connects later to Cyrus.
Exactly. It anticipates the rise of Cyrus the Persian, who is explicitly named in 2 Chronicles and Isaiah as Yhwh's instrument to deal with Babylon.
So even amidst all that judgment, Yhwh's sovereignty also holds the promise of restoration.
Yes, absolutely critical. From Jeremiah 24 onward, hope starts to reemerge. Even in the bleakest warnings, you get lines like Jeremiah 4:27, yet I will not make a full end.
And then those really key promise texts in Jeremiah 30:31, the book of comfort. What's the main message there?
These chapters are just central. They offer this unconditional promise of return, of renewal for both Israel and Judah. It emphasizes Yhwh's deep, enduring love, like in Jeremiah 30:10-11. There's also the 70 years prophecy in chapter 29, suggesting the exile is limited, homecoming is planned, and even the earlier advice to cooperate with Babylon, like in chapter 42, can be seen as a strategy for survival, leading towards that future restoration.
And the really big idea here is the new covenant.
Yes, Jeremiah 31:31 through the relationship, not like the old one they broke.
How is it different?
The law won't be on external tablets, but written internally on their hearts, leading to this deep personal knowledge of God. It's a vision for a future focused on internalizing God's will, which you see playing out later in figures like Ezra and the reading of the Torah in Nehemiah 8.
Bruggeman also places Jeremiah within the wider stream of Israelite tradition. How does he connect him to earlier influences?
Well, he stresses the deep ties to Sinai, to Exodus, to Hosea's prophecies, and especially, as we said, to Deuteronomy.
Right, the Deuteronomic connection seems huge.
It's immense. It shapes Jeremiah's language, his rhetoric, his whole understanding of covenant and consequences. Some scholars even talk about a specific Deuteronomic group or school of thought in Jerusalem that Jeremiah was likely part of.
And how does he fit with the other big prophets like Isaiah and Ezekiel?
He's right there among the major prophets, the latter prophets. They all wrestle with the trauma of exile, Assyrian, Babylonian, and they all carry this dual message. Judgment, yes, but also future restoration.
Shared themes.
Definitely. And there are really strong links between Jeremiah and Hosea, particularly that family imagery for the broken covenant, and this idea of a Yahwistic leap, God moving beyond judgment to grace. Though, interestingly, unlike in Jonah, Jeremiah's warnings about repentance mostly fall on deaf ears in his time.
He also connects Jeremiah to other types of literature like Psalms and wisdom.
Yes, Bruggeman notes how Jeremiah uses the style of the lament psalms. He borrows their language to pour out his own anguish, his complaints, even his accusations against God sometimes.
Like in chapters 15, 17, 20.
Exactly. And there are links to wisdom literature too, using proverbs, reflecting on the limits of human control, the need for divine wisdom. Plus, of course, the traditional link between Jeremiah and the Book of Lamentations, grieving over Jerusalem's fall. And later books like 2 Chronicles refer back to Jeremiah, showing his lasting influence.
And finally, what about the New Testament? Bruggeman points out some surprising connections there.
Yeah, several key ones. Matthew connects Herod's killing of the infants in Bethlehem directly to Rachel weeping for her children in Jeremiah.
Right. When people wondered who Jesus was, some thought maybe he was Jeremiah come back. That's in Matthew 16.
Yeah.
There's that slightly tricky reference to Jeremiah, and the potter's field in Matthew 27 might be mixed up with Zechariah, but it shows Jeremiah was in the mix. And maybe the biggest one, the letter to the Hebrews quotes Jeremiah 31, the New Covenant passage, directly.
Applying it to Christ.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Seeing it fulfilled in Jesus.
So this ancient book, written in crisis, clearly still speaks today. What's its enduring relevance for us?
Bruggeman argues that Jeremiah's big themes, crisis, judgment on injustice, hope for renewal, they just resonate powerfully today.
In many contexts.
Absolutely. Think about huge historical traumas like the Shoah, or collective shocks like 9/11, or even just the personal crises of faith people go through. We have to be careful with direct one-to-one analogies, of course.
But Jeremiah offers this incredibly powerful language for talking about vulnerability, about loss, about the struggle for meaning when things fall apart. It reminds us, ultimately, of a God who is still sovereign in the chaos and who has the power to bring new life out of destruction. That's a theme that echoes right into the New Testament.
So wrapping up our deep dive into Bruggeman's theology of the book of Jeremiah, we've seen its complexity, the absolute centrality of Yhwh's sovereignty in both judgment and promise, and how this ancient voice keeps speaking to our own challenges and hopes. Hopefully this has been a useful shortcut into the heart of Bruggeman's insights.
And maybe it leaves a question for you, the listener. Thinking about these powerful themes from Jeremiah, analyzed through Bruggeman judgment, hope, crisis, renewal, how do they maybe connect with your own life, your view of the world today? It's a potent lens for reflecting on our own times, our own vulnerabilities, and maybe the potential for new beginnings.
Definitely something to think about. And if you want to go deeper, we absolutely recommend checking out Bruggeman's book itself, The Theology of the Book of Jeremiah, or other great commentaries on this incredibly rich text. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.